Welcome back to another session of Swami Reacts, where we get together to reflect about different works, movies, books that have the potential to steer those things that need to be steered in order to continue exploring our potential. So today, I'd like to share with you a very beautiful book that was recently recommended by a friend of mine to read called Hindu and Christian in Vrindavan by Klaus Klostermaier. Klaus Klostermaier passed last year. He was a Christian priest, but also one of the earliest Western scholars to take my tradition, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, seriously on its own terms, not as a subset of Hinduism, but as a rich, living, unique school, emotionally sophisticated path of divine love, as we come to know it. So this is a short book, as you can see, small but very powerful, and the setting is very interesting because this happened in the mid-60s, and at that time, Sri Bhaktivedanta Vana Maharaj, one of the disciples of Srila Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur, who had an institute of theology in Vrindavan, he developed this project of inviting representatives of different traditions to learn about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, to learn about Vrindavan, but to also conduct their own studies and to engage in what we may call interfaith dialogue. So that's the setting of the book. Klaus Klostermaier is being invited by Sri Padmanabha Maharaj for what we may call a 2-year period, a 2-year interfaith retreat. Organized by Bon Maharaj's school. So 2 years. This book is a summary of Klaus Klostermaier's experience in those 2 years in Vrindavan. So he was, of course, a Catholic priest when he arrived. He continued to be a Catholic priest during and after his stay in Vrindavan. But in one way, by reading this book, you can clearly see how the experience of being in Vrindavan 2 years and to immerse himself in the practice, in the culture, in the presence what was going on around him totally transformed him. Not by converting him to any variety of Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma, but somehow by softening the borders of his religious identity and opening the space for actual dialogue where love can speak more deeply than dogma. Let's put it that way. This is something very beautiful that I found, and I want to share with you a few sections from the book to give you a taste of it. But in the very introduction of the book, when talking about what actual interfaith dialogue is about, it mentioned that too often this interfaith dialogue is set up as an encounter of representatives in a contest of comparisons, or worse still, a contest of courtesies. But unless this dialogue grows out of the gentle delving and slow maturing of friendship, dialogue is only an exercise in indifference, the very antithesis of love. So that's just introduction for you to fasten your seatbelt. So in this way, for me, this work of Klaus Klostermaier, which is not only a book, but his lived experience, as every book should be, reminds me often of, I cannot avoid comparing or sometimes relating with my own experience, that when approached with openness and sincerity, another tradition, as I like to call sister tradition, will deepen, not dilute my faith, my own tradition, my own conviction, my own perspective, my own embrace of the heart of God. So in this way, for me, this was very moving to witness Klostermaier's work and how he allowed, in this case, Gaudiya Vaishnavism and the broader Hindu umbrella of faith to help him rediscover his own Christianity. At any moment, you will feel that he's diluting or losing a tinge of his faith in Jesus. On the contrary, he's gaining more and more perspective and depth and breadth. So similar, in my case, I always say it many times, Christianity helped me to rediscover Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So if taking a glimpse at Christianity or a deep dive into Christianity or other mystical traditions helped me to rediscover my own. How can I speak of these two as different? Hmm? If other tradition is giving me new language, articulating the same things in a fresh way, giving me new eyes to rediscover in awe and wonder my own faith, how much I can label that as other, how thick can be that boundary. Hmm? So the book is beautifully written, I might say, at the time when there was no chat GPT to add suggestions or additions, beautifully written. He writes not with any detachment from what's going on outside of him, around him, but with deep reverence. Even when he's questioning some of the things he's seeing, you can always feel this sense of the sacred, in between the lines in each of his words. His appreciation for the aesthetics of devotions, for the dynamics, for the colors, for the festivals, even for the simple things. Many chapters in the book, or some of the chapters, are about like his pilgrimage, everyday dialogue. There's one chapter, and so many other things that he just describes the daily life in Vrindavan, but with sacred eyes. Hmm. So through that, he's showing how theology can actually be embodied, hmm, can be sensory, can be playful, hmm, can be sacred. Hmm. So so much humility as well, so much appreciation, so much presence in his words, so much attention to detail in his description, and so much discernment and introspection. I would say so much sincerity. You can find here a very honest writer, an author full of integrity, full of commitment to his ideals, and not hiding anything when writing any of his words. But by writing, he's exposing, opening his heart, and opening ours as an extension of that. For me, a high point of the book, of many, to be honest, I took some notes, and at one point I stopped marking because the whole book was to be marked. So beautiful. High point for me will be the one chapter called Theology at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. You can imagine, Indian summer. So one section of the whole thing, despite describing again in utter detail the torture of the heat and how the sun is basically like a monster devouring everything, all with deep reverence and sacredness. At one interesting point, poetically, he starts to compare his own European background and comforts in comparison with the hardships and gifts of living in Vrindavan. So I'd like to share with you a few lines of that section because it goes longer than that, but it's very touching, at least it was for me. He says, he compares of his background with India, his own background, European background, will be the theologian at 70 degree Fahrenheit, and the theologian in India, the theologian at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The theologian at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, in a good position, presumes God to be happy and content, well fed and rested, without needs of any kind. The theologian at 120 degrees Fahrenheit tries to imagine a God who is hungry and thirsty, who suffers and is sad, who sheds perspiration and knows despair. But all this is already too Hinduistic. A theologian at 70 degrees Fahrenheit and with a well ordered life sees the whole world as a beautiful harmony with a grand purpose, the church as God's kingdom on earth, and himself as promoter of the real culture of humanity. The theologian at 120 degrees Fahrenheit sees the cracks in the soil and the world as a desert. He considers whether it wouldn't be wiser to keep the last jug of water till the evening. He wishes the heat was a few degrees less, and he has to exert all his Christian faith, trying to find a little bit of sense in this life wherein he plays such a very insignificant role because he depends on so many people. Hmm. So this hopefully this gives you a glimpse of the mood and the tone. And again, as I told you, the humanity of the writing, the confessional human tone of Klaus Klostermaier's tone. And for me, he's not writing like a distant anthropologist. He writes like someone who was paying attention and being invested in what's going on, identifying, being empathic, being part of that, with humility, with vulnerability, mm, and almost a poetic level of detail. If there is something that characterizes his book, is the utmost level of detail. He's not telling us what people says, but how they're saying it, how they are sitting, what their eyes are revealing, in utmost detail. It's a level of presence that, in my opinion, we desperately need in the times we are living, when presence is so much lacking, when the detail and the specificity and the enchantment of what happens in between, even in the tragedy, even in the cracking, even in the wounding, but paying attention to what's actually taking place, can take us to a different place, can redeem us on so many levels. At present, we live in a world that is saturated with noise, with absence, with lack of attention. But Klaus Klostermaier's book reminds us spiritual truth often emerges in the silence between words, in the paying attention, in how we hold someone's gaze, mm, how we listen without rushing to label, rushing to put a like or a dislike, but being there and accepting reality as it comes, as it is. Mm. So, so for me, yeah, there is something in itself. It's beautiful. There is something magical, miraculous, I will say, about a Christian priest and scholar coming to India in the 60s, to Vrindavan, more specifically, the land of Krishna-bhakti, encountering Krishna-bhakti, encountering himself as a Christian, rediscovering his faith, and again, emerging not as someone who left his faith, but who found it anew. Mhm. That's what Klaus Klostermaier did. And to be honest, I relate. That happened to me. And I know that that didn't happen only to me. Mhm. So that's the usual dynamics, of the spirit. And sometimes the sacred becomes stale when we grow up in it. Now, it's not that the sacred became stale, but our perception of it. And then we lose sight of it for a while. Let's call it the last dark night of the soul, or however you may like. But when we dare to enter another sacred landscape, when we dare to look at things from a different angle of vision, we start seeing our faith with fresh tears, with fresh eyes. To respect. Respect means to look anew. Spect from spectacles, to look again, to look anew, to take a new look from a new perspective. But again, many times for that we need to take another seat, dare to embrace a new angle of vision. And dialogue is all about that, embracing diversity, embracing the commitment with the truth. So let me conclude by reading one more brief section, where the author almost concludes the book speaking about dialogue, which all this book is about it. He says, dialogue was not a mere talking about religion. That is very often pure babble, vanity, self-glorification. Nor was dialogue the comparative religion of experts. The comparison of religions is interesting only so long as one has not understood what religion is really all about. One can only compare what lies on the surface, Maya. The real dialogue takes place in an ultimate personal depth. It does not have to be a talking about religion, but something does distinguish real dialogue: the challenge. Dialogue challenges both partners, takes them out of the security of their own prisons their philosophy and theology have built for them, confronts them with reality, with truth, a truth that cannot be carried home black or white, a truth that cannot be left to gather dust in libraries, a truth that demands all. So for Klaus Klostermaier, Vrindavan, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Hinduism in general, didn't threaten his Christianity, it nourished it. For me, similarly, learning from other traditions doesn't mean betrayal. It's an act of fidelity, loyalty to the God who speaks in many tongues, and dances in many lands and hearts. So, a few thoughts about this beautiful work, Hindu and Christian in Vrindavan. I hope this sparked your curiosity to dive into the book, which is available on Amazon and other places. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we share, whether you've read the book already or simply reflecting on the themes we've shared here today. So, thank you so much for your presence and attention, and see you in our next session of Swami Reacts.